I have some that says Louisiana Department of Health.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Train that. How many you need?
I think we're planning for 100, right?
I think everybody that has donations for their donations is doing about 100.
So y'all got 100? No, I mean the homeless population or with us?
That's what she was saying.
Wow. That's interesting.
Some of them,
They're like living on people's couches and stuff.
yeah, and then there may be some of them that might be living in a home that doesn't have electricity, water,
I see it.
that kind of stuff, because they
Yeah.
can't technically be homeless in that parish. It's
Or no.
yeah.
Can't live on the street.
Interesting.
I'm gonna Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will answer them at the end.
Welcome to our Behavior Health Around the State educational series. LAMHA collaborates with our partners around the 10 regions of the state, all of which share similar missions to us. We're offering this series aimed at bringing attention to and education on key mental and behavior issues and initiatives affecting our individual communities. This year's Behavior Health Around the State series focuses on such topics as suicide prevention, youth mental health, gambling and substance use, intellectual disabilities, and developmental disabilities, LGBTQ+, and maternal mental health. We are very excited to bring experts from our local communities and from around our state to provide current and relevant information on these issues. In our 4th year, we are continuing to offer these educational series through our long-term partnership and support with the Office of Behavior Health. We are also thankful to you as our listeners, as we look forward to hearing from you on what topics you feel should be highlighted as we continue to grow these educational offerings. I hope you enjoy today's topic and take away something new from our speakers. Please join us in the coming months as we discuss more topics affecting you, our communities, and those we serve. Thank you.
My name is Jim Whalen, and I represent the Tennessee Institute for Gambling Education and Research. We're an academically focused group who have actually run gambling clinics for the last 20 plus years. See if I can get my slide to advance, and a little bit about who we are. As I mentioned, we've been doing gambling research for 20 years. We've also have run a clinic, and a couple of years ago, we're now expanding services to do just in addition to our clinic in Memphis, Tennessee, to also have a clinic in East Tennessee and soon one in the middle of the state, as well as an online service. Our approach, to be fully disclosing, is that we are academic researchers who really believe in the reciprocity between what happens with people, what we learn in the therapy room, we bring back to the research lab to ask questions to return that to the therapy room. What I'm hoping to provide you with today is sort of an overview of what gambling is, talk a little bit about the harms of gambling, and a wee bit of information about the interventions for those who are experiencing those harms. As I mentioned, our unit, our whole mission is about creating and managing an accessible, engaged evidence of care. And I'm hoping to share with you the sort of primary aspects of what we do and what we know that informs how we work with those with gambling harm. Also, for full disclosure, is most of my funding comes from the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services here in Tennessee, as well as we do receive some funds from the International Center for Responsible Gambling. So let's get started. You talk about gambling, and it seems kind of weird sometimes to think that we need to define it, but I'm going to give you a definition, and I'm going to back away from it a little bit, and that's the betting of money or things of value on a game or event where the outcome is unknown in the hope of winning additional money and or material goods. So that seems, it's an academically sort of interesting definition, and I wish I could tell you that that covers all, but it really doesn't. Also, what's real important is what people perceive as gambling is a little different than the way we academically might define it. I almost chuckle not too long ago when I was preparing for an interview about sports wagering and its impact and what people thought about it, et cetera, et cetera. And we've been filled with conversations about sports wagering. And then I suddenly remembered an article that came out at a Canadian study, very well done. I think it was published in 2011 or 2012. But in that study, they asked people, a large number of Canadian citizens, about a variety of activities and whether or not they thought they were gambling. And in there, it included sports wagering, which ended up to be in about the middle of the list. In fact, 53% of Canadians in that study saw sports wagering as gambling. I think if we redid that study today, we've come to a very different place, which is my way of introducing the idea that I have this academic definition, but what we really see in the world is that gambling is continuing to evolve, is it continuing to expand, and how we understand that will also continue to expand. So recently, for example, a lot of conversation going on both academically and in the media about what activities people engage in while they're gaming, internet gaming. And in a game, they come across a loot box, or they come across sometimes what ends up looking like a casino. So the world of gambling has expanded tremendously. And in particular, in the US, what we're seeing is sports wagering has been the last sort of big growth we have recognized. So that in the last 30 years, we've gone from where people wanting to gamble had to go take a trip. They had to go to Atlantic City or somewhere in Nevada or overseas, to there being a drive. Throughout the 90s, casino gambling expanded across the United States, as did tribal gambling, so that most people were within 100, 200-mile drive to a casino, to most recently the idea that all you need to do to reach for the phone. Sports wagering has highlighted that reach for the phone. But we also have a number of states, I don't think Louisiana is included in it, but a number of states that have online casinos as well. I'm going to push one other little turn about that access issue, because the access issue, what I'm referencing so far is about the legal forms of gambling. We have a fair number of people who come into our clinic. We're in Tennessee. There are no casinos, and casino gambling is not legalized. But we've had a stream of clients who come in who are on an online casino, although it's illegal in Tennessee to do so. The sports wagering is growth in particular. I wanted to highlight that for a moment, because this is data from June of this year, which was the end of the legislative cycle for most jurisdictions. And what we see is that since 2018, we now have 33 states plus the District of Columbia that has legalized sports wagering, and a handful of studies where it's legal, but it's actually not formatted yet in a way that people can access. And we're down to just 5 states that there is no legislation, and 7 states where there's dead legislation, meaning legislation has been dropped and not picked up. I've worked some with a few jurisdictions this past year who had questions about gambling, and I believe what we're going to see is more legislation coming. Maybe New Hampshire, Georgia continues to struggle with it. I think it's going to continue to expand. And part of the reason why is, one, is it's tax dollars. That's what legislators are looking at. But in addition, consumers are interested in gambling, and they're interested in being able to sports wager. And so that drive is going to likely continue. And it is up, in my mind, it's really up to regulators, oftentimes being fairly new to the whole business of gambling, but legislators and those operators who are offering online wagering opportunities to come to some agreement about how to best regulate it and enforce it and set up the appropriate fences so that we can manage or create safety nets for those who have harms. We talk about the harms. I think it's really important to consider gambling along a continuum, as the title of this talk actually introduced. What we know is at one end of the continuum, we have about 10 or so % of the population that do not gamble at all, or have never gambled in their life. Most people, however, we would put in a category of recreational gamblers. And that means they gamble periodically or occasionally, that they typically approach gambling as a recreational activity, something they do for fun. And they do it with a really good sense of limits or knowledge about how much money they're willing to lose. But at the other end of the continuum, we're dealing with probably about 1% to 2% of the population, which meets diagnostic criterion for a gambling disorder, and about another 3 to 5% of the people who experience what we would refer to as problem gambling, meaning some subclinical level of difficulties, meaning they're experiencing some diagnostic symptoms, and they're also realizing some harm due to their gambling. Some of these people appear, as best we know, to stay at this sort of subclinical level. We have other people who appear to vacillate from being recreational gamblers for a while to getting into periods where they may be causing harm, etc. But again, not meeting that diagnostic criterion. But that 1 to 2% is a pretty reliable number. Prevalent studies, some very good, some are questionable, around the world have shown that 1 to 2% number seems to be a fairly reliable one. There are some places around the world where that number's higher. That number also tends to grow a little bit in any jurisdiction when there are new available forms of gambling, but then seem to, after a period of time, return back to that 1 or 2%. So let me talk a little bit more about what that means for Louisiana. Those numbers, that 1 to 2% and that 3 to 5%, that means in Louisiana, there are probably 70,000 individuals who will experience a diagnosable gambling problem in their life, and another 175,000 people. These are broad estimates based on the most recent census number I can find, but about 175,000 people who may have some subclinical level of harm. One of the important things I always think I want to shine a spotlight on is that we do know from some research that was done down in Australia that each person with a gambling problem seems to cause harm for, on average, 6 other people in their life. So while there's the individual that may be meeting diagnostic criterion, there are financial, relational, occupational harms that occur because they're gambling affects those who are close to them, and maybe a fair number of those who are close to them. When we think about the diagnosis, a little bit of a history lesson, but pathological gambling first appeared in the DSM-3 as an impulse control disorder. It was an evolution from the pre-diagnostic appearance to what was referred to as compulsive gambling. The compulsive was dropped because of its suggestion that problems related to gambling may be similar to OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorders. In fact, there was this literature at the time about obsessive compulsive syndrome. And gambling is very different, where most people are bothered by their obsessions. They're made upset by and stressed by those obsessions, and they engage in the compulsions in order to alleviate that distress. In gambling, the preoccupation, the pursuit of gambling is something that people greatly enjoy. And in fact, they engage in the behavior because that in itself is enjoyable. So it's a very different mechanism, and hence the term pathological gambling. At that time, and that's also the reason why it was seen as an impulse control disorder, even though as we went to the DSM-4, we began to see it more as having some characteristics of what we think of as an addiction, specifically that there's issues of tolerance and also growing evidence in the literature for withdrawal. Which brings us to 2013, when the DSM-5 was published. And in the DSM-5, we changed from pathological gambling to disordered gambling, or gambling disorder. And gambling disorder was clearly placed within the spectrum of other addictions, with the diagnostic criterion very modifying slightly. It moved from 10 diagnostic symptoms to 9, and we'll get to that in a second, but really emphasize that flavor of addiction, and that is that there's a behavior that's excessively engaged in, that people who report a tolerance for that engagement, that they experience harm when or difficulties when they try to control it, and that excessive engagement and failure to control it results in harms in their life. So those three kind of key characteristics of addiction get carried forward into the conceptualization of gambling disorder. The criterion, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are 9 of them. And anyone with access to the internet can find these criterion. So I'm not going to talk about them very specifically, but I'm going to highlight how these criterions, at least by the data, appear in individuals with gambling harm. The most common symptom, and one that's very unique to gambling and is not suggestive of other addictions, is after losing money gambling, the person often returns another day to get even, or maybe even get even later in that day. This characteristic actually appears in about 60% of the people who gamble at all. So it's maybe not the best indicator that they're having problems. And it's probably a symptom that drives people to become more preoccupied with it, although the majority of the people who report chasing, this is referred to as chasing, don't necessarily elevate to meeting diagnostic criterion. So this is the most common symptom that people report, not the best flag of somebody that has a problem or is in need of treatment, but maybe a precursor to having a subclinical level of gambling harm. At the subclinical level, what we see is this is really where this preoccupation with gambling appears. So it's people report this, they're thinking about gambling a lot. They appear to have utilized gambling to relieve distress. That distress may be an affective disorder, depression, trauma, sadness, anxiety as well. Also distress that may be related similarly, and almost, we don't know the kind of order of it, but with elements of people having experience other addictions and coping using other addictions, and now cope using gambling. And then finally, the real evidence of a burgeoning potential diagnosis is that they lie to conceal the extent of their gambling. So this lying is sort of the precursor to the harms that really occur, and that is that lying as a way of interfering with important relationships, occupational problems, school-based problems for college students, and maybe even some high school students, or job difficulties. I mean, we're in the process right now of finishing touches on a study of a pretty large sample of college students, and one of the interesting things we find is some of these college students, particularly those who are gambling more frequently, are also dropping out of classes, report that they have experienced some decrease in their GPA and are thinking about possibly dropping out of school. Some of it may be financially related, but also it's just being in control of their lives, and that gambling and probably other risk-taking behaviors that we see in college students may be undermining their academic success. At a diagnostic level, that's where these 4 other symptoms pop up. That is the tolerance symptoms and the withdrawal symptoms. So increasing money in order to get the same level of excitement, as well as having difficulties controlling or cutting back on their gambling. And finally, we're now seeing the real evidence of the harms being produced. That harm, first of all, will happen in a financial area of their life, but a very close proximity. It's going to be injury to key relationships. And I don't mean just relationships of a partner or a significant other, but maybe minor children that the person has responsibility for, severing relationship ties with other family members or friends as they engage more in the gambling that becomes the cornerstone of free time activity. And at the most severe level is where we see people engaging in desperate attempts to secure funds. And we've seen the gambit of them here, including in our clinic, and we've treated probably 1,400 people so far in our tenure. And what we find with folks is that they're borrowing money from others or taking money from others. About 9 to 10% of these people will commit a crime in order to secure funds of gambling. And the majority of them don't perceive themselves as committing a crime. A lot of the crimes are white collar crimes, but we've even had instances of individuals who have pretended to hold somebody up in the parking lot in order to get money and return into a gambling venue. Almost always these people think about, so like an example is somebody we saw a couple of years ago who left the gaming facility, held a person up in the parking lot that they know they had won money. And their response was, well, that person didn't deserve the money, they just got lucky. So real distortion of what their behavior is and what that means to them, which is different than you often find with people who will engage in these sorts of crimes. The consequences, as I alluded to a little while ago, is it raises its head in financial, and it's probably, depending on who the person is and their current situation in their life, can be pretty substantially disruptive. It's easy to say people who gamble, who have a lot of resources, can tolerate a little longer, and we've treated people who have made high 6- and 7-figure incomes, who the money's not really what the issue is, but it's something they do feel. They're not bankrupt, but we also have had people who become homeless because of their gambling, and people who are thrown out of their home by their family members because of their gambling and because they don't trust them to be around them and whatever money access they have. But closely, as I mentioned, behind that is the interpersonal problems, and people will reveal them as you talk to them. Sometimes they're readily apparent. They have a partner who says, yeah, give up gambling or we're done. But more oftentimes, people kind of see that they're causing harm to these relationships, but don't fully embrace it. They see the relationship as being a problem and a difficulty. And then correspondingly, there are some people, as I noted, that have legal problems. And then the other issue is and this is hard for people to sometimes grasp, but the gambling harms themselves result in mental health issues. There was just recently a meta-analysis about the link between suicidal ideation and suicide attempts and gambling, and found that when you compare people who don't have a gambling problem with those that do have a gambling problem, those that do have a gambling problem have an odds ratio of 1.75 to have suicidal ideation, and a little bit lower than that to have a suicidal attempt. What that odds ratio means is that the chances are substantially higher for somebody to have some suicidal thoughts when they have a gambling problem. the rate at which they attempt that problem is a little harder to put a finger on, for obvious reasons if you know the suicide literature. But we're seeing that is a big jump compared to the general population. When we talk about comorbidity, I thought I had my comorbidity slide. Let me jump to comorbidity. Co-occurring disorders. I call it co-occurring because I think sometimes comorbidity sort of suggests that these problems are linked to each other, and they are sometimes, but they're not always. The other question and the reason why I lean on co-occurring as opposed to comorbid, and comorbid's fine here if the definition of comorbid fits, but I think conceptually talking about as co-occurring allows us not to make some assumptions of which problems are primary or come first and which ones tend to be secondary. But when we look at this is the results from a meta-analysis of all studies that examine co-occurring disorders. And in this literature, what we find is a very high rate of substance use disorder, particularly nicotine dependence, which I have a tendency to throw aside and not give a lot of time to. But I was just actually reviewing a paper which was on a study of a very large study or very large number of Canadians. Canadians have a fair amount of money to do research around gambling, and this was a great project where they actually tracked about 500 people who had a gambling problem across 1 year. And one of the things they found is that we're looking at what seems to predict people persisting in having a problem versus where a problem might trail off. And one of the things that predicted whether or not there was a decrease, someone experienced a decrease in gambling symptoms, was whether or not they changed their smoking or their nicotine intake. A reduced nicotine intake was sort of related to a reduce of harms. That's probably related to the role of stimulant use. Nicotine, as many of you know, is a central nervous system stimulant, and there are a variety of behaviors that gamblers engage in order to stay awake and stay engaged in their gambling. Caffeine, which was not assessed in that project and is rarely assessed, but caffeine is another a stimulant that's often used by people who have gambling problems, as are energy drinks or the mixture of energy drinks with alcohol. The other things you see here is that a higher than expected rate of alcohol use disorder and the use of non-prescription drugs or opioids. Mood disorder is also very common, with about just under 40% on average in studies looking at the co-occurring problems, with major depressive order around 23% and bipolar at a much lower rate. Bipolar, we have to sort out there that the diagnosis says that you can't have a diagnosis of a gambling disorder if they may be explained by a manic episode, but this bipolar disorder, which was not where it was not explained by a manic episode. The other rule out, which is a really hard one to rule out, is sociopathy. And when there is sociopathy, a gambling disorder gets ruled out. I think we've seen people with who might meet the diagnosis of a sociopathy, and I really think that while those two problems may be related, I'm not sure one should rule out the other. We've actually had pretty good treatment of somebody getting control of their gambling problems, while their general tendency to be disregarding of social norms is really evident in their life. And then finally, the role of anxiety disorders. Fascinating role here. It's mostly about people where gambling relieves their experience of anxiety, although we do have some people who experience anxiety that because they're not gambling, so they tend to withdraw from their gambling and they experience anxiety. But it's much more likely that gambling comes a way of moderating those experiences of anxiety and panic, we've actually had a couple people come through our clinic who experienced OCD, where their OCD symptoms disappear while they're gambling. Kind of an interesting, entangled, complicated picture to treat, but we have seen a few, not very common, but there are a few. Which takes me back to risk factors. The risk factors should not be surprising to anyone. The history of substance use is a key one. Of course, if someone has engaged in an addiction in their lifetime, that addiction becomes a way of coping with the world for them. And I don't think of it as that it's symptom substitution. I think it's more that people develop other ways of distracting them from their own lives. But we also see cannabis and alcohol use. The cannabis has been one that's really been hard to study in the United States, but there's some evidence coming out of Canada. And we've done 3 or 4 projects now looking at cannabis and gambling. And what we're finding is that those people who are more frequently using cannabis while gambling, and they're individuals with a gambling problem, that it really seems to precipitate and create more difficulties with their gambling disorder. The other factors is that income and education, big factor. Part of it is that those people with a low income or with lower levels of education tend to be the same people, and they're also the people who, one, may get involved in gambling in order to get by, to have money to live with, and therefore they also can easily financially ruin their life. Youth, gambling is probably where the first alcohol consumption, cigarette, all those other things tend to be around 15. The first exposure to gambling for those who tend to have a gambling problem on average is around 13. So they gamble at a younger age. Some of that is that there probably is not as many prohibitions culturally about children gambling. The idea of putting lottery tickets in a Christmas stocking, et cetera, is not seen as something that's wrong in many communities. But kids tend to start early, and when they do, and they're also, the other factor that happens in adolescence is kids tend to be sort of protected from some of the harms. That if you have a home and you are already provided 3 meals a day, that's not necessarily something that you're going to lose because you're gambling. But we've done a couple of studies with adolescents and find that they may be harming themselves in other ways, particularly around who they interact with and crime, and as well as academic difficulties. Men's men's an interesting issue in that when I first started doing work in the area, it was probably 55 to 60% of the people we treated were men. And over time, as casino gambling spread and became more normalized as a legal activity, we almost saw in our clinic about 50-50 men and women. It may be that more men were still experiencing it, but and we're seeing it differently in the clinic because women are more likely to be accommodating and interested in psychological interventions. We're seeing the change that's happened since 2018 and the legalization of sports wagering, and in some ways, young men tend to be more impulsive. We're talking about young men with disposable income, but I think it's also because young men watch sports and they engage in the behavior much in watching sports and being in the fandom world a bit more than do women. I don't know how this is going to change or evolve, but at least right now, we do sort of think about identifying as a man as being a risk factor. We also have a little bit of evidence that the LGBT community has a higher incidences of gambling problems than do the cisgendered and we'll call heterosexual communities. That it appears in a couple areas that individuals who would identify with LGBTQ tend to be more risk takers in some ways. Not that they're necessarily more impulsive, but they're more likely to take risks. I don't want to characterize it as something that is inherent in an individual because of their gender identity or their sexual preference. But it may be more about living in a world where you do and you're encouraged to engage in things that others disapprove of, and you're doing them in a secret way. I'm not sure. Not a lot of research has spelled that out, but I do think that those individuals who work with the LGBTQ plus communities might want to be thinking about how to be attentive to when somebody may be gambling in a way that is harmful to them. When we talk about treatment of, and I'm a little over time now, but I'll get quickly to this. When we talk about treatment, what we know is that treatment for gambling disorder is best to be cognitive behavioral interventions that are specifically aimed at interfering and gaining control and building skills around how to control gambling, and building the efficacy for that control. So we see that face-to-face interventions and CBT interventions have the largest influence. As far as challenges go, the big challenges for those interested in treating those with gambling problems is that we only get a very small percentage, maybe 10%, who come to treatment. And it's hard sometimes to keep these people in treatment. For you providers there, I'm going to skip forward to this last slide I have, and that is how to screen. So this is called the Brief Biosocial Gambling Screen. You can easily find it online. It's 3 easy questions that you can insert in an intake packet. And if somebody answers yes to one of them, it's worth having a conversation. If they answer yes to 2 or more, then I would move forward to see if a gambling problem or a diagnosis might be appropriate. So with that, I'll close out. This is our research team and clinical team with the who work in our gambling clinic, and I appreciate everyone paying attention. Thank you.
This is Janet Miller. I am the Executive Director for the Louisiana Association on Compulsive Gambling. And I was asked to come here today to talk to you and the population that are watching this video about gambling disorders, which I have been working with and treating since the late 90s, and been working with the Louisiana Association on Compulsive Gambling since 1999. We helped establish in that year the first residential gambling treatment center for Louisiana, as well as in 2000, we started the Louisiana Problem Gambling Helpline. And since then, also developed another treatment center in New Orleans, and also outpatient programs throughout the state. We have helped with training, different avenues of help. And so what I really wanted to start with today was the discussion, what is gambling disorder and what it isn't, is it is not something of a mental health issue only. What it is, in 1980, was the DSM-3 categorized it in the area of a mental illness of impulsive control disorder. What happened was they developed an idea that it was compulsive, impulsive, and so they called it compulsive gambling disorder, and that was in 1980 in the DSM-3. Since then, the DSM-4 changed the title of gambling disorder or compulsive gambling disorder to pathological gambling disorder, leaving it still in the category of impulse control disorders. However, as research and studies were pointing to and understanding more about gambling disorders, was that in 2013, so almost 10 years ago, the DSM-5 recategorized gambling disorder to the addiction area, which is well overdue, even 10 years ago, and also titled it gambling disorder, removed pathological, removed compulsive. So it's important that we call this what it is and not use some other terms. However, there are two terms or two names that come about throughout our community. You'll hear these names on some commercials or certainly through the gambling industry. That will be problem gambling. Problem gambling term is any behavior that is gambling related that causes harm to the player or the family. Very different than gambling disorder. People can have a problem with gambling, can have a problem with alcohol and drugs, can have a problem with some mental health issues, but it doesn't mean that it's an addiction or a true disorder. Gambling disorder is identified as a severe and persistent problem with gambling behavior, and it is an addiction. So it's important that we identify that this is an addiction that should be treated as such. It's been 10 years in knowledge of that in the medical field, yet we're still catching up sometimes in our medical field locally as well as our communities. We cannot treat, as we've found out over the last 20 to 25 years, gambling disorders the same as substance use disorders. Many times in the beginning days, often we thought that we could place people with gambling disorders in the same realm of treatment tracks and treatment therapies as those who had substance use disorders, mainly because it was and is an addiction, and there are some similarities. What we found out in years since then, and certainly in the last 10 years, is there are far greater differences at times. Differences that certainly as a clinician or as a community member or family member is that we want to make sure we appreciate and also understand that difference. And so clinicians need to be properly trained with gambling disorder, with the proper techniques or best practices with this disorder, and also to be very open to be under supervision with other clinicians or professionals and work in collaboration, because most of the time we see people with co-occurring or triple occurring disorders or addictions. And so one of the studies that we have been working on and looking at in the last 20 years is watching the incidence of substance use disorders with gambling disorders. Depending on which study people are looking at across the nation and in other countries, it can be at the lower end of 35% of those who have gambling disorders will also present with a substance use disorder, up to what we have seen is 60% of the same answer rate. What we have seen is a higher incidence, 73 to 84, almost 85% of the population we treat with gambling disorders have a mental health concern. First and foremost, what we have been seeing through different studies and research is anxiety disorders. So that can come in different forms and different ways that the person develops those. Also mood disorders and depression. So what we've had to work on in treatment and assessing the person with gambling disorders is, did they have the gambling disorder and it in turn develop this secondary or co-occurring depression or anxiety or mood disorders, or were they first having problems with anxiety, mood disorders, depression? Because again, it's a higher number, a higher study rate than even substance use. And did the effects of gambling that affected their brain change how they felt in their anxiety, depression, or moods? And so what we're seeing is the answer is yes, which is not what most of us like to hear as clinicians or professionals. Is we would like to have it all identified and detailed out, at least I would. However, what I do know is this, after working with gambling disorders for almost 30 years, is that we need to be very well skilled in all areas of other addictions and other potential mental health issues. One of those being that I have been following some studies with Dr. John Grant, Dr. Brewer, Dr. Litchfield, and others that are out there, is the evidence base that there is sexual impulsivity, sexual different behaviors that somebody will present when they also present with gambling disorders, which I find interesting because both of those problems, both of those disorders can be hidden and invisible. So the only way that you can identify first, then assess, test, or screen for gambling disorders, we have to ask a question. Do you gamble? And the second thing with sexual behaviors, we have to ask those questions too. Since they are not seen or we cannot screen for them like substance use disorders, which has been highly effective for those of us working in addiction field, is if our patients tell us they are not drinking or using, we can certainly take urine, blood, hair, nail, different samples to identify if somebody has been using and even how long ago or the levels or thresholds of those use of substances. With gambling and sexual behaviors, that is irrelevant. And there is no testing per se for this. So what I have found over the years in doing some smaller study groups at CORE, our residential treatment center, is that in private, we are to ask those questions. And certainly as a clinician, we need to be comfortable with that. And if we're not, again, that's why we collaborate with other professionals and other people that are comfortable talking about sexual areas. But that if we start asking about their concerns about their sexual behaviors or someone else's concern with their sexual behaviors, then what we can find is a truer answer. And oftentimes people will tell us the truth if we ask the question, but the question has to be asked first, and that's up to us in our responsibility as a professional to ask our patients all areas of concerns. Just like I'm going to ask my patients, are you taking your medicine? How are you sleeping? Have you been eating, exercising? I am going to ask those things. I need to be asking, as I would encourage you to do, is ask the same questions about gambling and ask them over and over again because we cannot screen for it. And if we know of a patient of ours who has gambling disorder and may have, without thinking of it being a gender or sometimes gender neutral disorder with sexual behaviors, we need to ask men and women alike about whether there is some concerns in sexual areas with them. And so this fascinating work that's going on out there, I encourage all of you to Google and research it and let me know what you find out as well. And so what we want to make sure is that we address in the clinical approach for gambling disorders is different for certain areas. One is we have found that there are layers of grief and grief processes that we have to walk through as a clinician, helping the person who has gambling disorder as well as the family. One of the most obvious areas that we know that they've lost is money or their financial securities. So we want to process that, but we also have seen over the years that there is a layering of effect of losses that many people who present with gambling disorder have. One, people losses through death. And what's happened is they've occurred at a timely rate that there's almost no time to process one loss before another loss occurred. So if you're working with a patient who has multiple losses, and that could be in any area that we can think of, then also explore with them if they've been gambling in their recovery of mental health issues, in their recovery of substance use, making sure that we're asking the appropriate questions, even for those patients who are in recovery or stable in recovery because they can be doing this behavior without us asking the question. The other thing that we see that is imperative to working with someone who needs recovery from gambling disorder is to address the financial aspect. There is a different response emotionally and in historical factor for the person with gambling disorder. So if you're going to help someone, but you're not comfortable as a clinician or even a family member or community friend of someone who has a gambling disorder with the area of talking about finances or budgets or debt or counseling of that, then please refer them to your local agencies, which we have across the state. And sometimes I tell people that most people would like to help people. So if there isn't an open agency of debt counseling and family credit debt counseling, anything that assists them in looking at their debt and developing budgets and financial plans, then locally ask your bankers, ask accountants, ask financial planners who would be willing to give of their time pro bono to help us to help our people in these areas. I cannot stress this enough of how important this is and how helpful this is to gambling disorder people to have such assistance and resources and referrals to help with debt consolidation, debt reconciliation, not debt bankruptcy, because that is most often where people that I work with would like to think to go. But we want them to do things that afford them to pay the restitution, to get out of the debt, because what can happen for them if the debt is lifted too quickly in recovery is it can ease off the pressure. And oftentimes people who have mental health issues or substance abuse issues, and we do with gambling disorders, is that families and friends don't want any pressure on them. Well, what we have noticed with gambling disorder population is that pressure on them is actually inciting some positive energy and some wherewithal to get a job, to get a second job, to think again, to get out of the box, to receive help. And so generally speaking, if we're helping people in the areas that not only assist them with recovery, then we have to address the recovery in debt and recovery from poor financial decisions. But if people knew how to develop a budget, live on a budget, they would do that. And so we need to help them to do that. And if you're not comfortable doing that, then receive help and resources in your local community. That's what we started with. And then eventually at CORE, the residential treatment center, we developed some programs within the treatment program that helps them to start addressing their emotional responses to money, reactions to debt, forward budget planning and financial, freedom for them. And so we start that the first week of treatment. And I think that's highly important. In support groups around the country, there are things that do that as well. And so it's important for us to learn from the people who are already assisting other people in recovery, as we have in other self-help support group populations. And so they too work with people on finances, budget planning, debt repayment areas. And so many counselors or many people, when I go to churches or community events to talk to them about gambling disorder and what to look for and what not to do, is this: how do I know, or how do I ask someone if they're having a problem? What's a quick test for that? I said there's two questions, and it's called a lie bet question. And basically the first one is, have you ever lied to anyone important to you about your gambling behavior? The reason that's important is because in 2022 and soon 2023, most people of gambling approved age have gambled. In fact, some people before that age. And so what we want to do is accept the reality that there's a lot of gambling. And so if someone is starting to lie about something that's been normalized in our society or neutralized almost in how we respond to gambling now, we want to pay attention if they're starting to lie about that to someone important to them. It's not important to me that they lie to people at work because there's might need to. But it's important to me that those people who have an investment in where money goes, that they have an investment in the mental health of someone else in their family or friends, if they're beginning to lie about that, that could be a red flag. So if there's a yes to that, you can move on to getting them some resources and help. But the second question, if there's a yes to this one, would definitely mean you need to move them into getting resources and get a full assessment for gambling disorder just to rule it out, or if it's ruled as appropriate that they may have the disorder, then to get them proper help. And the second question is, have you ever felt the need to bet more money? What that starts establishing is if they're noticing an increase of money spent, then what's happening is a loss of control. And what we see with that is most of us like to control, especially about our money and about our behaviors. So if they're starting to notice that they're needing to bet more money, then they are in a red zone for us. So any one of those questions, if they say yes to, I would move them on to calling the Louisiana Problem Gambler Helpline, 1-877-770-STOP. The other number that they can call in Louisiana is the National Council Problem Gambling number, which rolls to the helpline in Louisiana, which is 1-800-GAMBLER. Across the nation, most of our states are moving to that particular number so that we can have one number posted all over the US that anytime people can call and get routed to their proper state helplines and get help and resources for that. So it's 1-800-GAMBLER. And it's toll free, confidential, and we answer it in Louisiana. In fact, our organization answers that. And like I said earlier, it's been answered by us since the year 2000. So we have 365 days, 24 hours, 7 days a week answering. It's a live person, never automated. And so we are here all the time to answer questions for those who are gambling disordered or problem gambling or family and friends. The other thing that I wanted to touch on today was that gambling in the US and beyond the US and other countries has actually been at the all-time high the last couple of years, mainly because most of us know now that sports wagering and online gambling has increased the accessibility of gambling for everyone. It used to be people would have to get dressed, get out to their car, drive across some place in town, and go to a brick and mortar we call casino, or sometime an establishment or truck stop or whatever to gamble. That is no longer the case, and certainly not in Louisiana. And so what we've seen are people have easier access to something. It does show a higher rate or incidence of addiction at times. And because Louisianans have a higher access rate now to online gambling, to sports wagering, to all the different platforms available, that is just so easy to access that we are seeing more and more people calling the Louisiana Problem Gambler Helpline and identifying sports wagering or online gambling as their play of choice. In fact, as high as 73% of the callers last year identified sports as their game of choice. It didn't mean that they didn't gamble other ways. So we're seeing a change in that type of person who's gambling. And it's not just younger people. So we often will think that the internet or the phone use or whatever is more for the younger population, let's say 18 to 36, 35-year-olds. No, it is not just that. Because it's so accessible, we need to be asking those people who are maybe housebound, who may have medical and mental disorders that inhibit them from going out to a brick and mortar casino or truck stop or whatever to gamble, because now they have accessibility 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to gamble online and different techniques of gambling. And so in order to address this going forward for our nation, Louisiana Association on Compulsive Gambling through CORE, our outpatient programs, and our helplines, we are training up to learn the language and the lingo and the different techniques for faster movement of gambling, and also accessibility with cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, all the different avenues of resources to money and loans and currency. We're having to always expand our information and education. I would encourage you to do the same. And there's so much on the internet and so many different places, or contact me at LACG and we'll send you some resources. And again, you yourself as a clinician or a concerned person with someone who may have a gambling problem can utilize the Louisiana Problem Gambling Helpline yourself just to gain information. And I would encourage you, if you're a clinician, a professional working with other people, to call it anyway. What I don't do is I don't refer people and use resources that I haven't checked out for my patients. I would recommend you do the same and do a test call. You can be anonymous, you can tell us who you are, whatever, and find out what your patients are listening to or hearing from us. And then if there's any concerns you have or anything you want to tell us about it or feedback, please let us know. We would like to have that. And also the other thing that I agreed to make sure I would mention in this talk today was that we have many avenues of help resources for gambling disorders in Louisiana. One of the best kept secrets in Louisiana is CORE Center of Recovery. It established in 1999. We have treated thousands of Louisianans and also 36 other state residents and people from Japan, Turkey, Mexico, Canada, and the UK have come over hearing about the program to go through our program for gambling disorder. What we have established and continually work on throughout the years is to treat gambling disorder as the primary addiction, which it is, needing to be treated as such, and that if they have other co-occurring disorders, we can address those, but that is not why they are at CORE. They are there to gain as much information, as much counsel, and as much help on gambling disorder, because there isn't as much of that particular type of care for anyone, even in the United States. But Louisiana dedicated a fund when they signed the contracts for the casinos in Louisiana in the 90s to allow a portion of the tax money to be dedicated and funded for treatment, for helpline, for resources, and for training for Louisianans. And so what we want to do is make sure that we use that money to take care of our own. We care, I know you care, but we want to make sure that we refer them to places that they can get free, confidential, and educated help with this problem. And so there are 10 regional offices. We are one in this area that answers our outpatient services for the upper part of the state in this region district area, but there are 9 other offices that do the same. So the best way to find out where those are and who that is providing that care and services is to call the 1-877-770-STOP number. That number will route to the Problem Gambling Helpline for Louisiana, and you can ask for the resources for your patients, or the patients themselves or family can call as well. Some of the different districts will offer family counseling and group counseling for those free of charge as well. That is unheard of in many states across the nation. So we want to make sure that this word gets out, that there is wonderful best practices care in Louisiana, that other states know about us, but also Louisiana needs to know about us, that we're here. And if someone can't get to Shreveport, Louisiana to go to CORE Center of Recovery, well, we will get them a Greyhound bus ticket and we will get them to treatment and get them home if we need to. We want to give people the care they deserve in a good treatment center that focuses on gambling disorder. And so please tell them about CORE. You can go on our website at helpforgambling.org. You can look at a virtual tour of the facility so you can see it first before you send someone. You can call CORE at 318-424-HELP, H-E-L-P, 318-424-HELP. Call them, talk to some of the staff, the director, the intake person, and gather information so that when you get ready, because I'm sure in your groups, I'm sure in your one-to-one private practices, there are people who are struggling and suffering with gambling disorder. But we have to ask those questions like, do you gamble? And then if they do, here's these other two questions. Have you ever lied to someone important to you about your gambling behavior? Yes, indicates a possible problem. Number two, have you ever noticed you started betting more money with your gambling behavior? Yes, they definitely need some help now. And that's where we can step up and help you to help them, or we can provide the care for them at CORE, the treatment center, or outpatient services across the state, or work in collaboration with you as a private practitioner. Whatever it is, we want to help, as do other districts and regions in the state for you. There is no reason in 2023 coming that anyone should struggle with a problem that we have such excellent care in Louisiana. The Office of Behavioral Health has assisted all of us in the state of Louisiana to provide better quality treatment at excellent care services for everyone in Louisiana, and it's free. So please call us today at the helpline or call one of the numbers I've listed in this talk so that you, your family, or your patients can receive the help that they need. Thank you for your time and your attention today.
So I would like to thank everyone for the wonderful presentations. I think those of our listeners who have engaged with us this evening have found the information to be a wealth of knowledge. If you are interested in hearing the experiences of other people, we've provided that. We've also provided some of the professional services that are available, as well as provided information from one of the top counselors in the nation for compulsive gambling. At this time, however, we want to move to a live interview between myself and former Senator Karen Carter Peterson. So good afternoon, Karen Carter Peterson.
Good afternoon, Dr. Dunham.
It's so wonderful to have you here and to be willing to share your experience with the audience. And so let's just talk for a few minutes. I think that there are many people who have followed your story, but have not heard from you personally and would be interested in hearing the path you've taken over these very difficult months since the issues have surfaced more for you. But I'm sure in the conversation, you will share information at dates farther back than this moment in time. So how about we start off with you just sharing a little bit with the audience about what this experience has been like for you with the addiction of compulsive gambling.
Sure. So again, my name is Karen Carter Peterson. I am a compulsive gambler in recovery. I want to say good evening to you, Dr. Dunham, and certainly thank you for hosting this along with your metropolitan colleagues, the Louisiana Mental Health Association and the Department of Health. I'm very appreciative of the work that all of you do as professionals on a daily basis to provide behavioral health services, and most often it's for free to those of us in Louisiana who desperately need the support, and particularly in this instance, compulsive gamblers. My story is a long one. I mean, it's certainly not going to happen within the next 15 minutes in its entirety. However, folks know my public life. They know the service that I've offered, but they don't know the pain in silence that I suffered, that I guess manifested itself in this addiction. You know, it's it's a painful process. I've been gambling for over 25 years. My first bet, technically, like in a casino, was when I was 16 years old. I'd gone to the Bahamas, and I was with one of my father's friends, and I was at a blackjack table, and I was playing next to the gentleman, and he was betting, and it was that he wanted to play two hands, and he won, I won, right? Won, whatever that means. And he gave me money on that trip at 16 years old, and I went shopping in the Bahamas. I remember that very specifically. And so, that was the beginning of a treacherous path. This disease is very insidious, very sneaky. I didn't gamble for years after that. But in my first marriage, when I was having some difficulties, I started gambling as an outlet and as an escape. It escalated. And after my divorce from my first marriage, it was really intense. And it grew. Recognized it, went actually to some inpatient programming that Methodist Hospital offered here in New Orleans. But then that at the time, there was no gambling program, like really robust program. And so I was there with others that were suffering from alcohol and substance abuse. So, I did a 2-week stint there, and then thought I was ready, but never fully in what I would call recovery. I know that now at the age of 53, that there's abstinence and that there's recovery. But I was abstaining for long periods of times. But what I realized is that whether it was the trauma that I did not talk about from childhood or from college or as an adult, or if it was the depression or the anxiety or the stresses associated with my many jobs that I had, right? Or it's other words, it's just life, right? And those things culminated with, this insidious disease manifesting itself and causing me to get into a really, really dark place.
So what would you say have been some of the greatest challenges for you in addressing your addiction?
Yeah, so good question. I'd have to say that my greatest challenge was pretty much overcoming my own fears and feelings. I use gambling, as I mentioned, as an outlet for stress, an outlet for anxiety, depression, past trauma, and what like I said, it would be just life issues. And surrendering was the hardest part. That was the biggest challenge, because I thought I could handle it. I can manage it. I'm smart, time and time again, I would say to myself, I can handle, I don't need to, I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna go to the casino, I'm gonna get my money back, and I'm gonna be good. I don't have to talk about it with anybody in my family, because this just doesn't make sense. But I couldn't control it. And I couldn't stop. It was just a vicious cycle. Because the addiction is insidious, and it doesn't recognize educational attainments. It doesn't care about titles, gender, profession, race. None of that matters. It's also very progressive, and the level of engagement, as I think some of my other peers that spoke, they talked about how quickly it escalates if you continue to stay in the disease, and there are no outward signs of it. So most people didn't even know that I was experiencing it. This addiction has the highest rate of suicide. I think Ms. Green mentioned that among all addictions. And I know that the shame, I felt shame and guilt and embarrassment, and that was a challenge to, there was a challenge to overcome that despondent feeling and not want to be here anymore. I mean, I felt that way. I know what that means. And the other challenge of the addiction, I would say, is where it can drive you, where it drove me. I would exhaust all of my personal funds. My family would try to put in safeguards, take away credit cards. And I would say, okay, I'm not going to do it anymore. But the urge was so great, I couldn't control it, and I had to escape. And so I went to a dark place and I did things that are outside of my character, my own belief system and values. I broke the law in order to feed my addiction, and I'm not proud of that. I breached the trust of those who believed in me and gave me an opportunity to serve. And for that, I'm truly sorry. And, my life moving forward, my next chapter is going to be about making amends, and showing people who I really am, and as a healthy KCP. And I'm in the midst of that process, not now, but I know that with God's help, because that's where I'm grounded. And
So you are now in a much better place for hope, it sounds. I would imagine that has not been the conversation that you've had at many points in your life. You mentioned that depression and sadness have co-occurred with the gambling. Had you ever been evaluated and treated for any other co-occurring conditions? The depression per se, a substance use disorder? Were there other diagnoses that you struggled with as well and were being treated for?
Sure. And I'm happy to share that, because, I'm just hoping this story will help somebody else, step out of that silent suffering. And yeah, I was suffering with anxiety and depression, and I had past trauma that I really had to dig deep. I went to CORE. Janet just talked a lot about CORE, and it caused me to be still and to just really figure out why I was going through these cycles and doing that. And so, yeah, on occasion, I'd find myself drinking to mask the feelings. But thank goodness that didn't get to the point where it became uncontrolled drinking, but there were times where I was binging. And so I know now after treatment that I need to be very cognizant of my alcohol intake and stay vigilant regarding, other potential comorbidities, because I'm vulnerable and susceptible to that. But the good news is that this isn't, there's light at the end of this darkness. And I've seen that light.
Well, tell us a little bit about what your healing journey looks like right now, the things you're doing, the things that you find are keeping you centered and focused for health at this point.
Sure. Happy to do that, Dr. Dunham. And that's really why I'm here. I want to talk about, faith and hope and how things dramatically can change. And for me, it's been just a year of intense introspection. I know there's help for so many others in the same situation. We don't have to live in pain. It all really starts with honesty and acknowledging that we are powerless over this medical condition, and then making sure that we ask for help, calling a number, checking yourself into treatment if necessary, and then just purely surrendering. That's the big one for me. Letting go and letting God. That's what worked. Not Karen's way, but God's way. And although I'd done, as I said, a stint of inpatient treatment years ago and been in outpatient care for many years and been in and out of what we call the GA rooms, that's Gamblers Anonymous for those that don't know, for 2 decades, it was only November 1st, my 52nd birthday last year, where I took a major step in my recovery and I checked myself into CORE, the treatment facility in Shreveport, and a miracle, I would have to say, was underway. There's people like you, Ms. Green, counselors all across the state at human services districts, the Mental Health Association, and the folks certainly at CORE, Janet and Shreveport, and my amazing family and friend circle, the support network that helped me to get healthy and see the light beyond the darkness. I learned more about myself. I faced my fears and my past trauma. I was able to build a toolkit that I now use to survive. I would say, literally a survival toolkit that I use daily. Each person has their own journey in a recovery path, but mine involves taking, small steps one day at a time by building a closer relationship with my higher power, who is God, and trusting that He is with me and working things out for my good. I know I'm a child of God, imperfect, very imperfect human being, as that, may be, but I'm working every day to be more Christ-like. But in order to stay off the bet, that's the little term we use in our Gamblers Anonymous recovery program. I use prayer and meditation. I use individual counseling, daily Gamblers Anonymous meetings. I do that religiously Monday through Friday. When I get off of here at 7 o'clock, I'll be on meetings, journaling, church service, exercise. I'm a fisherwoman. If you know me, I'm fishing and I love the water. It brings me peace. And familial support, praise music. I got positive affirmations all throughout the house, among many other things. And just a wonderful, wonderful husband that's very supportive too.
That's a
All that
great,
represents, let me just say this, all that represents learned behavior. Like I had to be diligent about it, develop a regimen, and use these tools when triggers occur. And they occur, trust, because it's life. But because, like, you know, I don't know if you've read this book, Dr. Scott Peck says in the intro to my dad's favorite book, The Road Less Traveled, life is difficult. Problems will rise. The only question is, how are we going to tackle them? Don't run to the casino, Karen. I try to face them head on. And sometimes that happens and I need some help. And I'm not ashamed to ask for it now. Make that call, pick up, call my sponsor, call, you know, somebody on the phone list from GA, call Miss Green. There's always Miss Green.
well, you've demonstrated over the course of your record, your stellar record as a senator, that of vengeance with which you take responsibility for the things that are within your control. And so it is in you to do everything you're doing now with the same or greater of vengeance, because your life depends upon it at this point, for sure. But one of the accolades you recently acquired is becoming a peer support specialist. How about you tell us a little bit about that and what that means for you moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, that was just amazing. You know, and that's something that's provided by the Louisiana Department of Health. I learned a lot about, it's a relatively new program around the country where, yes, I'm a peer support specialist now. I've got 2 more days that I have to finalize things, but I'm finished the training and I graduated last Friday. It's a great way to stay strong in my recovery by giving back and helping others navigate their own recovery journey. Essentially, you know, I'm using my personal story as evidence, and it can be a powerful message to still, you know, to I guess, help those that are still facing the impact of the addiction right now, feeling like their life is limited and they don't have any hope. But hopefully when I tell my story and help them utilize resources and be a connector, a bridge to help the people that are in the actual peer, the person with the addiction, but also people in the support circle at the agency, the healthcare providers, the clinicians, the psychiatrists, help them as they devise a recovery path for that individual. I can speak from my lived experiences to become that bridge of understanding and connection between the peer and recovery, essentially. And so it's a really exciting program, and I hope that people across the state and agencies like yours, Dr. Dunham, that you increase the number of people in your programming, because, you know, I know the pain, I felt it, I know what those compulsive gamblers that are still there going through this, and maybe it can be a spark of hope, and they'll take those simple small steps of courage if they hear and see. Because I knew for me, what really made it possible for me is that, you know, it was places like CORE and through the GA meetings, I saw the faces of recovery. And when I could see it, then I believed that I could be that person too. Like a trusted servant saying, oh, I haven't bet since for 40 years, but then you know their story and they tell their story. I'm like, wow, how deep and dark that was. But look at you, enjoying life, enjoying your family, being present and being, you know, just who we are is really good people. They say all the time that you're not, you know, the worst thing that you've ever done. And I know I'm certainly not, but I'm certainly going to be making amends for the mistakes that I have made.
Well, we so appreciate you taking the time to share such personal information with the group, recognizing that it is your story and the stories of others that have been shared here that can save one life. And if we can save one more, then it's worth all the time we spent this evening. So I thank you. And I'm looking forward to working more closely with you as we move forward on this journey together. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dunham. Looking forward to working with you as well.
Thank y'all so much. I think Josh Butcher is here. He wants to tell us a little bit about Central Louisiana Human Services District's gambling services. So I'm gonna let him jump on.
Hello, everybody. Let's all kind of have to adjust a little bit.
All right, so my name is Joshua Butcher. I am the Regional Prevention Coordinator for Central Louisiana Human Services District. Um, so we have 4 clinics throughout the region, Region 6 in Central Louisiana. We have one in Alexandria, Parksville, Jonesville, and Leesville. And we actually do have a counseling program that offers counseling for gambling services. We do one-on-one services with the counselor as well as group setting services at least once a week. They utilize CBT and EMDR with addiction protocol for the clients that are needing these services. And as a lot of you have seen before, it is completely free. So when they reach out to the clinic for intake, they do need to make sure that they are letting them know it is for gambling services. So if you have clients in the area that are trying to seek those services within our clinics, within our region, or even within their own human services districts that might offer it as well, make sure that they're expressing a need for gambling services. That way they can utilize that free grant provided service. Let's see, right now specifically, and I do have a little information. I'm speaking kind of on behalf of our substance abuse supervisor who couldn't be there. A lot of the resources that are out there, like the 1-800-GAMBLE number. There's also the GA hotline, which is the 888-502-5610. Those are always a good, line to reach out to. We also advocate a lot for mental health. As you've seen earlier, there was a lot of connection to mental health and addiction. So 988 is a call or text service for not just suicide, but crisis in general. It's something that's utilized nationwide. And they don't just have to talk to somebody on the phone. I know a lot of my generation, younger generation and below, we avoid the phone a lot. So we do try to make sure that people know it is a text line, and they can also go online and speak to someone in a chat service as well. So if you have any questions or anything else, I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Miss Claire, and I believe
And Josh, are you aware that LACG is one of the 988 Lifeline providers for Louisiana now?
I am not. That is
Well,
good to know.
Yeah, and so I actually told the team when they asked me to jump in on this was I could speak a little bit about that as well if you want that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good thing that we can kind of share. I will hand over to Miss Claire, but you can go ahead and take off speaking on 988.
Okay. 988 for the nation was launched last July in 2023, as probably Dr. Whelan knows and many others, that different states have been provided through the federal government and their state government funding sources and assistance to be a provider of a lifeline, not only for suicide, as Josh said, but also for any crisis in play. And so what we were working to do, certainly in Louisiana, Dr. Whelan can probably answer more for his state, but that we wanted to make sure if we were going to take that on, what that looked like. And so we had already been incurring on our problem gamblers helpline a lot of suicidality, different mental health issues, as we've all talked about. But then we were also looking at how can this assist the 911 or the EMS so that they're not handling mental health or addiction crises or suicides that are not in motion, but to also alleviate that and get safety plans in place and et cetera. So the state office with Department of Health and Hospitals contracted with LACG ourselves and another contractor, Via Link, in the New Orleans area to back each other up and to utilize different area codes is what they do nationally to route them to their proper closer area for services. And then we resource that or stabilize the person in hopes to not have to call 911 or EMS. What we've seen since the line opened for the Lifeline nationally was that less than 3% of our call volume or text or chat, as Josh said, is actually converting to a 911 or emergency service call, which is great. So it means like 97% of these callers are getting what they need, getting where they need to go, whether it's a warm transfer to a place, whether it is just a direction or resourcing, or just someone to talk to at a time. And so the callers are much longer than our other helplines for problem gambling and substance use helplines. They last anywhere from probably 12 minutes to up to 2 hours, but the general call volume is about 20 minutes. So that's a pretty lengthy call. And then we also have, of course, our staff is trained on how to answer and work with suicidality, as well as different crises. And then we have clinical staff here that also assists the team because they're not all clinicians answering the phones or text and chat. So if something else should occur, we have that backup system in place, and we have debriefing teams for the staff as well. And then if we get too busy, or New Orleans does via link, then they roll over to each other. And if our state had a natural disaster, many states do that, they'll roll to the closest state generally in that region because the resourcing is easier to obtain like that. So we're certainly making changes as we go ahead in the next year of this, but it has proven thousands of calls we've had, and been a heavy undertaking for our organization. We knew it because we had answered a suicide helpline, but we didn't know the magnitude. But it has been pulling off of the resources of the PSAPs, 911 call centers, and EMS. So that's really working. And also we're having people who know mental health or addiction services to really assert that into the help that we're giving the callers in text and chat, rather than having a criminalization almost of having the police there. Sometimes that has to be there for welfare and other things that go on with a caller or a contact, but that's really less than what we had imagined it might be by being less than 3%. So that's been a great thing. And it's a 3-digit number, 988. It took 11 years for the feds to approve that 3-digit number because they don't give them out very easily. We do not have the indemnification like 911 or any of the call centers yet. So we cannot do work per se back and forth all the time with that, but we can assist by picking up the phone and helping someone with an emergency if need be. So they're working on that legislatively. There's a couple states that have crossed over some of that barrier of liability and indemnity. I don't know if they can do it in Louisiana in the next year or two, but certainly it may happen in the next 3 or 5 years, let's say. So we'll see. That'll be important because I would like it for our people to have more indemnity and liability coverage myself. So just want to add that about 988. LACG is one of the providers and has been, and in fact, we sat at the table a couple of years ago working on policy and procedures. I say all this, but also knowing that, you know, James has a bunch of work that I've also watched from afar, just so you know. And I'm pleased that he's on this. I wasn't supposed to be on it, but I'm like, yay, James is on there. And then lastly, I know that people have asked a lot about sports wagering, online betting, cryptocurrency, all this information for Louisiana. We are working on statistics and pulling that information, but we have seen a heavy increase of call volume through the problem gambling helpline, not only for Louisiana, but LACG answers 20 other states' helplines. And so what we're seeing is not only are they doing more online and sports wagering, but it is moving to the younger population, where our general kind of average age was 34 to 44. The call volume now, and doesn't mean that there's not other ages, as we all know, having a problem, but the call volume or text volume to get help is younger now, from like 24 to 34. So, and again, there's a lot of variables to all that and the study with that, but I just want to put that out there. And also, there's not a lot of people that understand cryptocurrencies. Sometimes you got to have the right people. I wish that, I don't know who was supposed to come today, but I am still in process. I don't know about James, learning about cryptocurrency much. It's interesting, but I do tend to think it's very similar to the casinos when they went from all cash gambling to doing it within the game or within some kind of paper trail of that. And same thing with credit cards and that. So it keeps removing the reality of money to people, which is not helpful to the people who are gambling disordered for sure, I think. And also those who are problem gamblers, it's a little edgy, and it certainly can be its own impulsiveness sometimes and compulsiveness with doing cryptocurrency. So I really like to tell you more about it, but I'm not an expert yet.
Yeah.
So I said I'd share what I could with you today.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. So we are a little over time, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to Q&A. If anyone, I don't see any in the Q&A. If you have any questions, you will have to put them in the question and answer box because the chat is disabled. So I'll give just a minute and we'll see if we get any. Dr. Whelan, did you have anything you wanted to add while we're waiting? Oh, you're muted.
I said I hadn't thought of anything. Janet, I
Okay.
appreciate your presentation a lot, as well as the programs that are offered in Louisiana. I think people knowing more about what's available and that it's so affordable and that it's treatments for free. So you just need to get there. That is a great resource, and Louisiana probably leads the country in that form of accessibility. And so you guys are doing a great job. I really appreciate it. And of course the involvement of, I know Louisiana also have the involvement of peer recovery specialists. And I think as people are learning across the country now, there's great value in having that sort of resource and pairing it with good treatment programs. So way to go, guys.
Well, thanks again. We have no questions. So I just want to thank you guys for speaking today. We really appreciate your time and jumping on to, oh, we have one comment. Great presentation. A family member of theirs just went through core. So we appreciate it. All right. Well, we will go ahead and dismiss. Thank you all again. And I'm not sure if they'll share this once it's done, but anyway.
And thank you, Dr. Whelan, for your presentation. You are amazing. Like I was so thrilled when they were like, do you want to do this? I go, who's on it? And they said you. And I was like, yes, I just want to hear what you have. You're great. So I'm so glad
Thanks.
that the state got a hold of you. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for that kind comment. And, you know, we're all neighbors, so it's a good thing, right?
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. And everyone have a great day.
Take care.